Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 257, the last of the Pizarros. Last time we saw the return, short-lived victory, and ultimate demise of Diego de Almagro. With his death, any hope Manco Inca might have harbored that Spanish infighting would give him some sort of reprieve disappeared. Instead, Manco found himself forced to flee capital after capital in the never-ending game of tag with the Pizarros. After Gonzalo Pizarro forced Manco out of Villacabamba at the end of our last episode, Francisco finally felt himself secure. But that security would prove very short-lived. While Diego de Almagro might be dead, his faction was not. Hundreds of Spaniards had gone to Chile with him and received nothing for their trouble but heartache and quite a lot of frostbite. These men wanted their part of the pie. Now they found themselves sitting around and watching those encomienda owners who had come with Pizarro enjoying the good life, while they, gross, still had to work for a living. Something had to be done. The only real prospect for these men was to hope for a change in management. In other words, Francisco Pizarro had to go. By 1541, Francisco Pizarro was riding high. He had obtained all the prestige someone from his lowly status might have dreamt of. He was a knight of the Order of Santiago. He was a governor, a military commander, and a Marquis of New Castile, which was what the Spanish were then calling Peru. Although many of his wealthy encomienda owners, people whom he had granted natives, had quickly shed their armor and replaced it with silk stockings, plumed hats, and fine imported European clothing, mimicking the behavior of the nobility in Spain, Pizarro continued to prefer simple clothing, with no frills. One chronicler wrote as follows, quote, "The Marquis, that is Francisco Pizarro, commonly wore a high-waisted black cloth coat falling to his ankles, white deerskin shoes, a white hat, and a sword with an old-fashioned hilt. And when, on certain festive days, he was persuaded by his servants to wear the sable cloak that Hernando Cortez had sent him from New Spain, that is Mexico, he would take it off after returning from Mass, and would return to wearing ordinary clothes. Normally, wearing a towel around his neck so that he could wipe the sweat off his face. For when the country was at peace, he spent most of his days at playing a game." End quote. Not only did Pizarro dress plainly, but in an era when properly bred Spanish noblemen commonly took an interest in horses, hunting, and falconry, Pizarro preferred working-class sports and games of chance. Again, the same chronicler tells us, quote, "Both captains, Pizarro and Almagro, had great physical endurance and thought nothing of hunger. The Marquis showed this especially in his game-playing, for there were few young men who could keep up with him. He was much more inclined to play games of all kinds than Almagro, so much so that sometimes he would play bowls kind of ball game all day long without caring who he played with, even if it were a sailor or a mill worker. Nor would he allow anyone to get the bowl for him or treat him differently, as normally his high rank would require. Rarely could business even make him leave the game, especially when he was losing. Only if there was some fresh Indian disturbance, for he was very quick on such occasions and would put on his armor with his lance and shield and run through the city, heading straight for wherever the trouble was, and without waiting for his men, who would only catch up to him later while running as fast as they could." End quote. Meanwhile, back in Spain, Hernando Pizarro did not get the welcome he might have hoped for upon his return. Hernando was immediately clapped in irons and thrown into prison. He had, after all, murdered Diego de Almagro. There were many in Spain who were looking forward to seeing the arrogant Hernando pay the price for his crimes. One was a certain Enrique de Guzman, who had been in Peru at the time of Almagro's execution. Guzman wrote, "I, Don Diego de Guzman, a knight of the Order of Santiago, a gentleman in the royal palace and citizen of the city of Seville, was appointed to be executor of the will of Don Diego de Almagro, and by virtue of that office, I accuse Hernando Pizarro of criminal acts, who is currently a prisoner in this court. The Adelanto, Don Diego de Almagro, governor of the kingdom of New Toledo, in the Indies of the South Sea and in the provinces of Peru, labored in the service of your majesty, that is King Charles V, and conquered and settled many kingdoms and provinces in that land, having converted the natives to the service of our Lord and to our holy Catholic faith. While he, Almagro, was continuing to work in your royal service in this manner, the aforementioned Hernando Pizarro, moved by envy, hatred, and by an evil disposition, as well as by greed and self-interest, drove Manco Inca, king and lord of that land, to rebel against your majesty, whom Almagro had subjugated, reduced to submission, and had induced to submit to the service of God and your majesty. That's a little bit of a stretch there, but we'll go with it. King Manco rebelled, and for this reason that kingdom was lost and destroyed, and your majesty lost more than 4 million pesos in gold from your rents, royal fifths, and royal interests. This was also the reason why the natives killed more than 600 Spaniards, and that myself and Hernando Pizarro were besieged in the great city of Cusco. Not content with having perpetrated these crimes, Hernando Pizarro raised an army and marched against Governor Almagro, battling him near the walls of the city of Cusco and killing 222 men. Then, forgetting the great favor he had received from the governor, Almagro, who had released him when he was his prisoner, Hernando ignobly strangled Don Diego de Almagro, dishonoring him by saying that he was no Adelanto, but a castrated Moor. And in order to increase the insult, he ordered that a black man be his executioner, saying, quote, "Don't let this Moor think that I will execute him the way he wanted to execute me, which was to behead me." He then said, if the executioner was about to cut off my head with a knife, and the gates of hell were open, and the devil himself was there and ready to receive my soul, I would still do what I'm about to do now. End quote. Hernando Pizarro unjustly executed Don Diego de Almagro without having the power or the authority to do so. And for his actions, his atrocious, wicked crimes, besides having committed treason, he deserves severe civil, military, and capital penalties, which should be carried out against his person and against his possessions, as a punishment and example for others. So ends the letter of Guzman. Some of this was exaggeration. Some of it was, frankly, invented out of whole cloth. But outright lies though much of this letter might have been, the inescapable truth remained that Hernando Pizarro had ordered the death of Almagro. And everyone knew that Hernando had ordered the death of the very man who, only weeks before, had set him free when he had him in the same place. Hernando had the finest legal counsel in all of Spain. But in the end, it didn't do him any good. He was convicted and would spend the next 23 years in prison just outside Madrid. By the time he got out, he was a prematurely aged old man and partially blind. Hernando Pizarro died in 1578. He never returned to Peru, and he never saw any of his brothers again. While some of Almagro's men did return to Spain after his failed expedition to Chile, many remained in Peru and tried to eke out a living doing whatever they could. These men first believed they would strike it rich in Chile. They had not. Then they believed they would come to be wealthy landowners in Cusco. But their defeat at the Battle of Las Salinas quickly disabused them of that notion. Frankly, the Almagristas, as these men were called, had the bad fortune of simply backing the wrong horse. And now there was nothing to be done about it. The race, it seemed, was over. These men were so bitter toward the Pizarros that they did not even take their hats off when Francisco walked past, which was a massive insult. For his part, Pizarro decided to pretend that these men did not even exist. By June 1541, though, these Almagristas, these men, had made a fateful decision. The only way to change their lot was to get rid of Francisco Pizarro. And that meant killing him. These assassins, about 20 men in total, chose the date of June the 26th, 1541, as the date for the assassination. These men hated Pizarro so much that it was rather hard to hide the coming storm. Rumors of plots of assassination circulated Lima like running water. But still, Francisco paid them no heed. He had conquered the Inca after all. Why should he fear a few disgruntled men? June the 26th, the day selected for the assassination, was a Sunday. Pizarro would normally leave his house in the morning and walk across the plaza to attend Mass. Of great importance to the Almagristas was the fact that Pizarro would most likely be unarmed when he was going to church. What the plotters didn't know, however, was that one of their members, a man named Francisco de Herencia, had already divulged the assassination plot the day before, during his confession to a priest. The priest, in turn, had warned Pizarro. Although Pizarro had dismissed the story as mere quote-unquote Indian gossip, he nevertheless decided not to attend Mass the next morning, and had asked a priest to come to his house instead. Pizarro decided to go ahead, however, with his typical noonday meal, one that would be prepared for him and for a number of previously invited guests. The morning of June the 26th dawned cold and gray, as it was normal for this time of year. June, after all, is the beginning of the southern hemisphere's winter, and Lima, during this time period, is blanketed day and night by a slight drizzle of fog called a garua that can last almost 6 months. During these shorter winter days, the sun appears more like the moon over the city, a silver-gray disk constantly shifting. All night long, the conspirators waited, nervous and impatient for the daylight to begin. By the time a dim gray dawn appeared, the would-be assassins had already finished fastening on their steel breastplates and their coats of mail and sharpening their knives, daggers, and swords. Later, as the single bronze bell that Pizarro had helped forge began to reverberate above the cathedral, summoning the town citizens to gather, Almagrista spies suddenly arrived at the house of the assassins and informed them that Pizarro had not left his house for Mass. The governor was said to be ill, the spies said, and thus Pizarro probably would remain in his house for the entire day. The conspirators, quite naturally, immediately suspected that someone had revealed their plot. Now they had to make a quick decision. If their plan had been exposed, then momentarily they would be apprehended and either imprisoned or killed. Gathered in the house of the son of Diego de Almagro, the assassins turned toward the leader of the group, a man named Juan de Harada, who offered them this choice. Quote, "Gentlemen, if we show determination and are resourceful enough to kill the Marquis, then we will avenge the death of the Adelanto, Almagro, and will receive the reward that our services to the king in this realm deserve. But if we do not leave here and carry out our purpose. Our heads will be hung from the gallows in the square. It is up to each one of you, however, as to how you want to proceed." End quote. The Almagristas agreed that they had one choice: to carry out the assassination of Pizarro as originally planned. Throwing open the doors and armed with an assortment of weapons, they now swarmed out onto the street and began heading for the central plaza, shouting, "Long live the king," and "Death to tyrants." A number of the town's startled inhabitants no doubt watched them as they burst out onto the plaza and headed directly for Pizarro's home. The latter, which was a 2-story structure with ample rooms for servants, lay behind 2 courtyards and fronted the square directly across from the cathedral. Pizarro, meanwhile, having already heard a private mass, was presently dining with his half-brother, Francisco Martin de Alcantara, and with about 20 others in a large dining room upstairs. As the sounds of the men shouting began to be heard in the distance, Pizarro's page abruptly burst into the room and shouted, grab your weapons, because all those men from Chile are coming here to murder the Marquis, my lord." Almost immediately, the guests lurched up from their chairs, unsure what to do. In the confusion that followed, Pizarro and some of his companions rushed to the stairway that descended into the inner courtyard to see what was going on, just as the mob of Almagristas began entering the outer courtyard. One of Pizarro's pages, who had been working in that area, was the first to encounter the assassins. They stabbed him and left him for dead on the ground. Those of Pizarro's guests who witnessed the attack now realized that their own lives were in danger, and rushed back into the dining room, showing great cowardice. As the Almagristas began ascending to the main stairway, shouting for Francisco Pizarro to show himself, Pizarro's lieutenant governor, a man who had recently boasted to Pizarro about how he could count upon him in any crisis, climbed through a window, down the balustrade, and then fled through the garden below. Some guests followed him, while others tried hiding beneath large pieces of furniture. Pizarro and his half-brother Francisco Martin, however, along with 2 of Pizarro's pages and one of his guests, were determined to fight. They quickly rushed into one of the adjoining rooms to arm themselves. As the 5 of them hurried to strap on their breastplates, Pizarro shouted to another guest, Francisco de Chavez, to shut the door to the dining room in order to prevent the entry of the mob. Chavez, however, apparently hoping to just change the mind of the conspirators through discussion, walked through the door and left it open behind him. Only 2 years earlier, this Chavez had led a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against rebellious natives, in which he allegedly slaughtered some 600 native children. Now, in deciding to speak with the assassins, Chavez made a fatal error. His last words were reported as being, "Don't kill your friends," before, according to Pedro Pizarro, quote, "they killed him halfway up the steps, stabbing him many times with their swords," end quote. The Almagristas by now reached the dining hall, where they quickly began searching for Pizarro. "Where is the tyrant?" they shouted. "Where is he?" Still, in the adjoining room, Pizarro was unable to finish fastening on his breastplates, and was thus forced to leave them half-buckled. He seized a large sword and then turned to face his attackers, along with his 2 pages, his half-brother, and the only guest from among the 20 who had chosen not to flee, a man by the name of Gomez de Luna. There was now a fierce battle, constrained by the normal doorway, and with 15 to 20 Almagristas on one side, and Pizarro and his 4 companions on the other. 2 of the Almagristas fell, run through with swords, and now lay clutching at wounds. Their fellow conspirators, meanwhile, found themselves unable to breach the doorway, protected as it was by the defenders' 5 swords. Frustrated by their inability to reach Pizarro, the Almagristas now resorted to a desperate measure, shoving one of their own attackers through the doorway as a kind of shield, while the rest pushed forward behind him. Pizarro impaled this man, but in doing so, he tied up his sword at precisely the moment when the Almagristas pushed their way into the room on either side. As the sharp, slicing twang of sword upon sword filled the air along with the sounds of men's shouts and the scuffling of boots, the attackers, finally succeeded in slaying Francisco Martin, Pizarro's half-brother. Mortally wounded, he fell to the ground. Pizarro's 3 other companions soon followed suit, staggered by sword thrusts until one by one they crumpled on the ground. Pizarro now found himself surrounded by a circle of stabbing daggers and swords, receiving wound after wound until he, too, fell. On his back now and bleeding severely, the governor is said to have used a finger from each hand to make the sign of the cross over his lips, and then to have gasped the word confession, meaning he wanted time to confess his sins to God. One of the attackers, a guy by the name of Juan Rodriguez Barragin, is said to have picked up a large vase of water and lifted it high over his head, and then to have shouted, quote, "You can go to hell to make your confession," before bringing down the vase and crushing Pizarro's head. There on the floor, amid a pool of blood and water, in the city he had founded and in the country he had conquered, the 63-year-old conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, breathed his last. Perhaps not surprisingly, within a year of Francisco Pizarro's murder, at least 15 of the roughly 20 men who had murdered him were dead. Their calculations about all the success that the assassination was going to bring them had proven false. They should have read their history. They might have known better. They might have realized that these sort of plots never end well. Ask Brutus and Cassius if you're confused. One of these conspirators, one Diego Mendez, was convicted of the murder, but managed to escape. He made it all the way past the deserted town of Villacambamba and to Manco Inca. There, he told the Inca emperor that his greatest rival was dead. Manco welcomed one of Pizarro's murderers and offered him sanctuary. But any hope that this might herald the end of Spanish occupation proved fleeting. Charles V, after all, still badly needed Peruvian silver to fight his wars. In the power vacuum left by the murder of Pizarro, King Charles sent his first ever viceroy to Peru, Don Blasco Núñez Vela, to take control of the country. A new viceroy was exactly what Pizarro's assassins had hoped for, but more than likely only one of them, Diego Mendez, had lived to see this happen. Now he was deep in the jungles of the Amazon, and Mendez and his companions decided, with a new viceroy in town, the time was ripe for their next move. Manco's guests had realized that they were finally in a position to offer something of extreme value to the new viceroy, that is, the death of Manco Inca. Manco's unconquered kingdom, after all, still threatened Spanish control of Peru. It also continued to serve as a sort of lightning rod for the native defiance against the Spaniards. Both the viceroy and the king were equally anxious to put an end to it. If Mendez and his men could somehow manage to assassinate the rebel emperor, Mendez believed he had no doubt that he would end the Inca rebellion, and he would surely win a pardon for himself and his co-conspirators. In fact, if they played their cards right, they might even be rewarded. They might find themselves encomienda owners after all, which was, in the end of the thing, exactly what all of Pizarro's assassins wanted. The 7 renegades who were alive still then made a decision. Just as Mendez had helped to assassinate Pizarro, now he and his fellow exiles would likewise assassinate Manco Inca. They would then escape to Cusco and announce Manco's death. In order for Mendez and his co-conspirators to carry out their plan, however, they would have to wait until Manco made one of his frequent visits from his nearby capital. When an unsuspecting Manco finally arrived with his now 14-year-old son Tito Cusi, the 7 renegades quietly prepared their weapons, readied their horses, and waited. One of Manco's favorite pastimes was playing horseshoes a game in which each person had to throw a horseshoe so that it touched an encircled stake driven into the ground. One day, Manco was playing this game with one of his Spanish guests. As his son watched on, Diego Mendez pulled out a hidden knife and stabbed the emperor in the back. Titu Cusi, Manco's son, would later recall, quote, "My father, feeling himself wounded, tried to defend himself. But as he was alone, and there were 7 of them, he finally fell to the ground, covered with wounds. They left him for the dead. I was a small boy, and seeing my father treated in this manner, I wanted to go there and help him. But they turned angrily towards me and hurled a spear at me. That just missed killing me as well. I was terrified and fled into the forest below. And even though they searched for me, they failed to find me." End quote. Mendez and the other renegades now raced to their horses, leapt on them, and galloped away. All afternoon, the assassins rode in the direction of Cusco, putting as much distance between themselves and the town where they had slain Manco Inca as possible. As darkness fell, they continued to ride, leading their horses by their reins when they grew too tired or the path too windy. But in their haste, these assassins had made a critical error. They took the wrong fork in the road. By the time that daybreak arrived, they realized that they would have to retrace their steps. Exhausted, they tried to rest for a while inside a thatched roof building before continuing. But while the Spaniards were sleeping, squadrons of Amazon forest archers and native warriors discovered the building that they were hiding in and quickly surrounded it. Soon, they set the roof on fire. As the flames crept up the roof and smoke poured in one by one, Manco's assassins began to emerge, some just desperately running out, their clothes on fire, others, more calmly, attempting to climb onto their horses and escape. They didn't. The jungle archers immediately unleashed volley after volley of arrow at the escaping Spaniards, while other natives surrounded their horses and pulled the riders off, spearing and clubbing the men savagely. They killed them all very cruelly, and some were even burned, would recall Titu Cusi later. Within a short time, native warriors had killed all 7 of Manco's assailants, including Pizarro's assassin, Diego Mendez. Manco had already designated a successor, his 9-year-old son, Sari Tupac Inca. As you're probably guessing, a 9-year-old was not the best person in the world to lead an Inca comeback. If you guessed that, you would be right. Ultimately, Manco had simply made the same mistake too many times. He trusted the Spaniards. Or at least, a Spaniard. In the end, it cost him his life. Now only one Pizarro brother remained alive in Peru, 32-year-old Gonzalo. Juan had been the first to die. Hernando left, never to return. Now Francisco's death left Gonzalo all alone. Gonzalo was never the most level-headed of the Pizarro brothers. And now, left to his own devices, he failed to make even the remotely best of choices. Fuming at seeing his family's power chipped away, Gonzalo declared himself the new governor of Peru, disregarding the new viceroy sent by Charles V. Gonzalo's impulsive act was nothing less than treason. Before anyone can blink, Peru found itself once more mired in civil war. Fortunately for the Spaniards, there was simply not enough left of the old Inca imperial structure for the Inca to do anything about it. Spanish Peru fractured into those who supported Gonzalo and those who supported the king and his viceroy. Gonzalo made the choice easy for many, executing anyone he could get his hands on who refused to support him. Matters came to a head quickly. On April the 9th, 1548, a few miles west of Cusco, Gonzalo and his army of around 1,500 squared off against a similarly sized royalist force. The Battle of Jaquiahuana, as it was later called, was ultimately decided, though not by military but political force. At the critical hour, most of Gonzalo's men, Many, whom had been secretly offered pardons by the king's new representative, deserted and went over to the royalist side. Stubborn, impetuous, and brave, Gonzalo refused to flee, however, even though he knew that if he were captured, he was likely to be executed. Instead, once it was obvious he had been defeated, the veteran conquistador calmly walked his horse over to the royalist force and surrendered. The following day, quote, they sentenced him to be beheaded and ordered that his head should be displayed in a frame that was made for this purpose and hung on the royal gallows of the city of Los Reyes, end quote. The 36-year-old Pizarro, who, for 3.5 years, tasted the power only kings normally enjoyed, looked around for one last time at the country that he helped to conquer, and then laid his head quietly against a wooden block. An executioner lifted a steel axe and brought it down. Later, in his brother's city of kings, soon to be Lima, the head of the most handsome of the Pizarros was, quote, covered with an iron mesh, and above it was placed this notice. This is the head of the traitor Gonzalo Pizarro, who rebelled in Peru against his majesty and fought against his royal standard. Besides this, it was also ordered that all of Gonzalo's goods should be confiscated and that his house in Cusco be demolished and be sown with salt, placing a notice with the same inscription on the site. This was done the same day, end quote. Some 16 years after arriving in the New World, the last of the 4 Pizarro brothers to lose his life was dead. Together, he and his brothers had beaten the odds, frankly. They had conquered a fabulously wealthy native empire with only the tiniest of military forces. Yet ultimately, they had, through their actions, unleashed a powerful native rebellion and then their own civil war, technically twice, and had died amidst the chaos that they had created. The Pizarro's taste of wealth and power had proved short-lived. Francisco Pizarro's reign in Peru had lasted 8 years, a good portion of which had been taken up by Manco Inca's rebellion. Gonzalo had ruled his brother's kingdom for just 3.5 years, a period of constant and bloody turmoil. On the day that Gonzalo Pizarro was executed, only one of the Pizarro brothers, Hernando, was still alive, and he would be in prison for another 13 years. Meanwhile, as the king's men in Cusco salted the earth surrounding Gonzalo's palace and hung up that placard for all to read, far to the north, in the tiny kingdom of Villacambamba, the Incas were watching and listening, patiently, biding their time. Next time, the Incas make their final throw of the dice in a desperate effort to save their civilization. If you've enjoyed the episode, please check out the website, link in the show notes. If you'd like ad-free versions of the show, that's available too, link in the show notes as well. And you can try out Western Civ 2.0, 7-day free trial. You can click on that below in the show notes. This one, we're actually right in the middle at this point of the Wars of the Successors and Alexander the Great. I don't think I covered that at all in the original series, or maybe with one episode. Here we're getting a much, much deeper look into some really, really colorful characters. If you are wondering, yeah, in fact, Alexander the Great's mother was just about as good of a warrior as he was. She leads her own army at one point. Until next time.